these tests that have been developed for COVID-19, even though on the packaging and the regulatory documents say that it's not adequate for diagnosis, it's still used that way, right? All of the policies that come from the government are based on these testing results.
Right.
But the tests have no known error rate whatsoever. They can't give you one. Governments publish estimates, but if you read the fine print, you'll see that they're basically making the number up.
Sure.
And because they don't want to admit that they can't actually calculate the number because there's no gold standard to compare it to.
Right.
So we're basically using a test here that even if you fully believe that the virus is real and really making people sick, that still doesn't matter in terms of evaluating the test. We're using a test here that we don't even know what it's testing exactly. And we have no idea if it's accurate or not accurate. It could be 0% accurate. And I would say we should assume that it's 0% accurate because we've seen lots of evidence of the inaccuracy. So recently someone from the UK told me that they sent in a sample that they didn't even swab anything. They just took the Q-tip out and then put it back in the completed test thing, didn't touch it to anything. It came back positive. Someone else dipped it in a puddle of water after it rained, and it came back positive. You know that one of the African presidents did a test on fruit, and fruit came back positive.
Tulipopeleka sample ya papai tukaipa jina Elizabeth Anne, miaka 26, female. Papai lile lilikuwa positive kwamba lina corona. Tulipeleka sample ya ndege Kware, imekuwa positive. Tumepeleka sungura, ikawa determinant. Tukachukua kondoo, akawa negative, na kadhalika na kadhalika. Maana yake labda mapapai yote yale nayo yangewekewa isolation. Kwa hiyo ukishagundua kitu hiki, lazima ujue kuna mchezo wa ajabu unafanyika kwenye vipimo hivi.
And now the most recently is Elon Musk reported that he took 4 tests in one day and 2 of them were positive and 2 of them were negative.
Right.
An antigen test, but all the tests are inaccurate.
Right.
So we have, something that's completely arbitrary. And, if I did believe really that there was a virus and an illness, I would be extremely upset about this test because it's not, useful or helpful in any way, except in manipulating people's viewpoints and in making policy decisions that don't match up with what's going on the ground. I mean, if you just think about this from a common sense point of view for a second, if we have an illness that is deadly, right? Do we need a test even at all to know if people have it? Like, you just know because someone would be deathly ill and, from being healthy to deathly ill. And that's not what we're seeing, by the way. So this test is really irrelevant and should just be, all these tests should be thrown out, but these companies are making, billions of dollars hand over fist.
Correct. And we should add that the inventor of the test actually said it himself, that the test should not be used for diagnosis. And
absolutely.
And also probably important to say that these genetic sequences that a PCR test can detect, we're all humans, so we all have, similar or the same genetic sequences, but even if somebody was ill, like you're saying, it does not make sense to have yourself tested when we know that the test is not even designed to diagnose a viral condition.
Well, if we're talking about the PCR, it's not a test at all. What it is it's a manufacturing technique, and it's being exploited as a quasi-test. But really, that's not what it is, because all it does, it's a way to take something and make a whole lot more of it.
Right.
And it's kind of like been reverse engineered for this test in a way. Like you make a lot of something, and then you say, okay, what was there to start with, and did that represent something?
Right.
But the thing is that, like, the reason why these sequences come back positive from all kinds of things is, one, because they just are everywhere. What this sequences of genetic material really represents is just normal metabolic breakdown of genetic sequences. And they're going to be, when you get down into shorter and shorter lengths, they're less and less unique, just because of the mathematics of it. Right. And we're talking about pretty short sequences. So we see them almost ubiquitous in nature, but certainly they're highly prevalent in humans. The other thing is, you know, what about just kind of like clinically validating the test? You know, because if you normally, like if you would take a test and go out into a population of healthy people, you wouldn't expect to find any positive results because they didn't have the illness. Right. So that would be how you'd find false positives. And that's actually kind of the experiment that they're doing, is out in the community testing healthy people. But, you know, you could do an experiment where, let's say that you do test, you know, 10,000 healthy people in the community. Well, you could follow them, you know, over time and see how many of them actually get sick. And then that can tell you something about the test, because what I bet you'd find is that hardly any of them do. Mm-hmm. Right. And then that tells you, well, what's the value of this test then? It doesn't predict who's going to actually get sick.
Right. A lot of people don't understand the amplification part that has to do with the PCR test. Perhaps you could enlighten us all about how many amplifications are done.
Yeah, well, it's funny because PCR, that's what it is it's a method of amplification. It's a chemical amplification of DNA or RNA, essentially, is what it is. So it takes, you know, a single strand, or maybe you start with 10, whatever you start with, and then it doubles it, and then it doubles it again. And each cycle that you do doubles the amount that's present. So what you see is that means that the number after each cycle gets really high really fast, right? Because if you just do the first few in your head, so like let's say you go from 1 to 2 and then 2 to 4, 8, 16, 32, right? So now like you've been going up pretty small, but now 32 to 64, 128, 256, 512, right? 1028. You see that each jump gets bigger and bigger, right? Because it's doubling. Mm-hmm. So once you hit about 28 to 30 cycles, the numbers get so big that practically shows everything. Mm-hmm. It shows stuff that's not there, that's not really there. And it's just like when, like if you think about amplifiers that we're all used to, think about a stereo or, you know, your TV. And if you turn up the volume, you get more amplification. So, you know, when you have the volume at a normal level, it sounds pretty good. But if you turn it up really high, you start to hear that noise, that hissing, right? That in addition to the sound, now you're hearing. Mm-hmm. So that is because the signal that you want to hear gets amplified, but the noise in the background also gets amplified. Mm-hmm. And at some point, the noise becomes big enough that you hear it. And that's what happens on the PCR test, that the noise becomes big enough that it gives you a positive test. Mm-hmm. And that happens at about 28 to 30 cycles. Mm-hmm. Now, in July, Anthony Fauci, the American doctor who's, you know, the main person advising the administration there, he said that 35 cycles should be the cutoff, that beyond there, basically any result you get is meaningless. He used the word replication incompetent, but that translates to junk mm-hmm. results.
That if you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. Mm. Somebody comes in and they repeat their PCR, and it's like 37 cycle threshold. But you almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle. So I think if somebody does come in with 37, 38, even 36, you got to say, it's just dead nucleotides, period. When someone comes in and it's positive, they don't give them the threshold until you go back and ask for it.
Okay. But they've got it.
They've got it.
Right.
They've got it.
Basically, because the number is so big and that noise then is so big that you just get noise. Noise gives you a positive and it doesn't mean anything. So even if you believe this test actually like diagnoses an illness, if it really did, even then, once it was above 35 cycles, right, which is definitely a very conservative consensus from all the scientists that you'd ask this question to. You could go to any university around the world and ask them this, and they would say this. They would say something between 28 and 35 would be the highest they would ever use it. But if you go then to the United Kingdom now and say, how many cycles are you running for your COVID-19 test? Well, guess what? They're doing not 36, not 37, not even 40. They're doing 45 cycles. So that means basically all the results are junk, even according to Dr. Fauci. In the United States, even where Dr. Fauci is the federal guy, the states have different protocols, and many of them are using 40 cycles in the United States as well. So what the thing you can do is you can exploit this because you know that you're going to get positives and that if you do more cycles, you'll get more positives.
Right.
And so you know that if you go to 37, you might get, 20% positive tests. And if you go to 40, you'll get 30% positive tests. And if you go to 45, you'll get 60% positive tests.
Right.
So you decide where you want to set that based on the outcome you want. And then you can report those cases on the news, and then you can justify a new restrictive policy based upon that.
Right. So depending on the amplification that you can do in a test, you can simply just design the outcome, in other words.
It's like a customizable test, because it's not like an on or off, yes or no test. Like, let's say the test, you had a test to tell if a glass of water was full or not, right? So the glass is either full or not full, right? It could be partially full, it could be overflowing, right? But it's either full or not full. That's a discrete difference. You can't be both at the same time, right? And so tests like that, like a typical pregnancy test that, a urine pregnancy test that you buy in the drugstore, that's a test like that. Either there's an agglutination reaction, and which gives you the colored line, or there's not. So it's a yes or no test.
Right.
The PCR used the way that it is, it's not a yes or no test. You have to set a cutoff level. And this is, by the way, separate from the amplification. There's a thing where they use a fluorescent marker to label the strands that you're amplifying, and then they measure the brightness essentially of that marker. And they have to set a cutoff point for that. So where they set that also determines the amount of positives and negatives, right? And even if they dilute the sample, that also affects the positives and negatives. So you can customize this in many, many different ways. It's just like if you ever remember back in school where they grade on a curve, right? So they grade on a curve, and then all of a sudden you get a 65% on your test, which normally would be a C, but because everyone else also didn't get near 100, right? They make that now suddenly it's a B. Right? And just because they decided to set the numbers differently. And that's the same thing that can happen with a test like a PCR, that because it's not an on or off discrete test, you just decide if you put this curve on it, this number is positive. If you put a different curve on it, it becomes negative.
Absolutely.
And it's totally arbitrary, because it doesn't mean that the person is sick or not, or has a virus or not. It just has to do with where you set the cutoff point.
Many people get so freaked out oh, I'm COVID positive. Can you please tell them what that means?
Well, that just means that you had a positive test, which is meaningless.
Exactly.
So it doesn't really mean anything, but it could have real life consequences, right? Like in Canada and New Zealand, they have quarantined people, detained them for quarantine purposes, foreign travelers. So, you could actually, by testing positive, end up having a friend or family member being detained. Or prohibited from access to certain freedoms in their life as a result of you getting tested. So even though the test is actually meaningless scientifically, clinically, and in any real world way, there are serious consequences to it, and they're going to become, even more serious as things progress.